Welcome to From the Classroom. I'm Nate Quinnell, and I'm so thrilled you took the time to tune into our show. From the Classroom is a monthly show that we put together where we take the opportunity to share some of the great things going on in East Hartford Public Schools, and we appreciate you taking the time. Today's a great day on From the Classroom. Today we are hosting our new principal at Mayberry Elementary School, Mr. Leroy, Joe Leroy, who we are just beyond excited to have at Mayberry School, and I'm looking forward to introducing to you. So without Joe, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Joe, you're not a newcomer to East Hartford, although I know, and I'm sure as families watch the show, they've seen you in a lot of different roles and trying to figure out why we're introducing you here. So why don't you take our viewers through a little where you've been and what brings you to the position at Mayberry School now?
Sure, yeah. So, I've had the opportunity to live in town, to, be part of a lot of community events and things going on. My wife is from East Hartford, a lot of pride in that aspect, and just really proud to be part of the school system family and the town family. So, I started 15 years ago at the high school as a health and phys ed teacher. Really had a great experience with that for a few years and transitioned into the athletic director role, working with the student athletes, the students on everything that entails. So that was another fun transition for me. You talked about a lot of positions. I was also the director of health and physical education for the district. That was great for me to be part of a lot of different town and community type events that supported our kids in different entities. And then, ultimately 4 years ago, I was lucky enough to work at the high school where I'd spent the majority of my career and be an assistant principal. And working with the class of 2017, celebrated graduation with that 2017 family, and then in the summertime was fortunate to transition into the role of the interim capacity principal over at Mayberry. So a little different dynamic. Kids are a little bit different size, more my size than at the high school, right? But in October, I was fortunate enough to go through an extensive interview process where I was lucky enough to be named the full-time principal at the school. And so
I think we feel like we in the Mayberry community, we feel like we're the lucky ones, Joe. And what we've appreciated is over the years watching you and your career develop, it's excellence at every level and impact at every level. And we know how excited the Mayberry community was when our board made this selection and the response that's generated from that. So congratulations on that.
Appreciate it.
I like the little plug for your wife, too. That was a nice touch.
Yeah, you got to get them where you can, for sure.
So let's talk about that transition. So we go from working with high school students to elementary students. And I know you're a father of elementary students yourself, but what was that like going from working with, young adults to kindergartners? Like, how does that go?
Yeah, so I think the biggest piece of learning for me in the last half a year that I've been involved with the elementary school is the kids are the same, and so when you care about kids, I don't care who you are, how old you are, you care about kids at the same level. So the conversations may be a little bit different, sometimes not that different at the high school and elementary level, but at the same time, what is different is the size of the kids, just like with my own kids, I have a kindergartner and a second grader. And, sometimes when I talk to them, I feel like I'm talking to a 15-year-old or a 30-year-old. Same thing with our kids over at Mayberry. And on the other side, at the high school end, sometimes you feel like you're talking to a 30-year-old, a 45-year-old, or a 10-year-old, as we help transition our kids
and then it comes
through
to
whatever
the
they need.
students. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right. So, ultimately, the biggest change has really been, being able to be that new face, that new sense of energy with our team over at Mayberry, and really take a lot of time and effort to meet with families, to share with families goals and hopes and dreams for their kids. At the high school, they'll certainly tell you, hey, I want to go to college, I want to be a carpenter, I want to go into business with mom or dad, I'm super excited for this. At the elementary level, they're like, oh my goodness, I saw my picture on the TV the other day in the school, and that was the coolest thing ever. Or today's pizza day, right? Yeah. So the excitement level for school doesn't change, whether it's elementary or high, but just seeing the kids every day and how excited they are to be there. It's what I've seen. It's a little bit easier to get hyped up for school as an elementary school kid than a high school kid.
Yeah, still cool.
Still cool.
Still cool. So I think, and you've talked about this a lot, and I've heard you've talked about this a lot, this team at Mayberry, and I know how proud you are of Mayberry and the community there, and you've talked about the students and obviously our faculty and parents. Can you give us kind of a sense of Mayberry School? Some families maybe are new to town watching this. Seems hard to believe you could be in East Hartford and not know about Mayberry Village, but
Sure.
Why don't you give us a little sense of what that is and how that's important to you?
Yeah, I think, in working in East Hartford Public Schools for a long time, we know that, our vision is that, schools are the pride of our community. And, Mayberry is its own little community. And Mayberry is the pride of the Mayberry community.
Yeah.
And so, between families, visiting the school, whether it's during the school hours or on the weekends to go to the park, to play games, to be out on the blacktop shooting hoops. The school really is kind of the center of the village for us. And so, our families are super passionate, just like anywhere else, but, obviously I'm quite biased these days, super biased about their kids and about their kids' education. And so every day our families walk, many of them walk and give that goodbye hug right outside the door. And, we're really lucky to have them be super confident in us that their kids are going to get the best experience possible. And so what that school is for us is that center of that village that has a long history. And, I think that anybody from East Hartford knows the history of Mayberry Village and how much pride and how much excellence has come out of that area, but also still remains in that area. And, as we continue to have all our kiddos K through 5 come through Mayberry, we know that, that kid's got a little special something in them or she's got a little something in her that we know is going to kind of continue to exemplify that pride at the middle school or Sunset or wherever they transition next, and ultimately come back and hopefully live in the village and bring their kids back.
Yeah.
You had mentioned what's one of those things about high school to middle school, and though I feel like my hairline's getting a little higher these days, what makes you feel what makes you feel a little older these days is, a lot of our families have kiddos that I had early in my career, and their children are at the school, and that huge sense of pride of being able to bring their kid to Mayberry, having the familiar face in me as their former teacher, probably looked a little bit different 15, 16 years ago, but that culture of family, that culture of togetherness. And if you walk in our building, you see not only our families have that, but our staff is super proud. Our staff loves our kids, whether it's the kitchen staff at breakfast time or whether it's a staff member in the hallway giving a high five. That resonates with the kids and the families, and most importantly, the whole Mayberry community. Yeah,
no, it's super cool. And it's neat for me when you kind of drive into Mayberry Village and the school is there, and you think about from the United States Congress with Congressman Larson, who talks about Mayberry Village as being the orbit of the universe,
right.
To certainly a lot of the great leaders in East Hartford Public Schools that you and I have worked for in our career, worked with, coming from Mayberry Village. It is a very, very unique place that's very close to each other, and thinking about this ideal of that a community is raising its children together, and that we have a small role in that. That's a pretty cool thing. So I know at Mayberry, one of your early things on was kind of establishing a vision and identity of what Mayberry School is all about. And I see this in the hallways. I see it on your newsletters. Learn, think, and lead. Can you talk about what is Learn, Think, and Lead, and why was that so important to you?
Yeah, so I think, in the summertime when we think about what makes a Mayberry student or a child that lives in East Hartford and Mayberry Village, what's going to make them successful? A lot of times you have visions and missions that have so many words that some of us don't even understand what all of it means.
Yeah, those are my favorite ones.
Which is why pride of the community fit pretty well. Yeah. But Learn, Think, and Lead is about our kids. It's about our families, and it's about our teachers. And every day we know that that's an opportunity for our kids to learn something. And yes, reading and writing and math and science, social studies are all very important aspects of our process. But so is developing our kids as people, and developing strategies for them to be able to communicate effectively, for them to be able to handle emotions effectively, and ultimately to be able to have relationships and identify people and things and places that they care about, and how they show that. And so that part of that learning process is, of course, number one, that academic end, but also developing that whole kid end. I really like what you said when you talked about kind of that community raising the child, because that's what we are, is a community and a family, as a family learning together. When you talk about thinking, every situation makes us think.
We hope. Our best situations.
Our best situations, right. So, our decision-making as adults and kids, we always go back to that learn, think, and then you lead. And so when we're able to think, we know that we can control what we can, which is making good decisions. And sometimes in the classroom, whether it's a math problem or a certain word that's tricking us to a relationship with a peer or an adult, sometimes we have to think a little bit harder to figure out what the best answer is for us at that time. I had the opportunity to sit in with one of our team members who was talking with a couple kids about ways that they're able to cope with someone when they're frustrated, or just a time when, gosh, that math problem seems so hard, and they're talking about all these strategies, and she's trying to give them all sorts of things to think about, and the kid's like, you know what I do? Sometimes I just take a deep breath 3 times and I'm good to go. She's like, well, why am I even here if we're having that conversation? Yeah. But I think what's so special about the thinking piece for us is that our kids are thinking about what works for them. Yeah. And thinking about ways that they're able to learn. And then the leading part is, we have entities of parents and teachers and kids that learn how to lead together, and then ultimately want our kids to be able to lead themselves. And, we have at Mayberry what are called our Tiger Ways to Be, which, one of those big things is how we're safe. Another is how we're respectful. And ultimately, it's how we're problem solvers, yeah. And part of that leading piece is how we can be a problem solver for ourselves and for those around us. And I think, like I said to you before, as a father of 2 young kids, being at Mayberry has really helped me learn, think, and lead with my own kids and my own family to take a minute to think before I want to impart my dad leadership on my kids or more importantly, sometimes my wife, depending on that situation.
Yeah, of course, we see ourselves in our work, and we see our values and our character all come out in that. And I think for me, I would share the experience that you're talking about of being a parent and then watching my kids at my school and thinking of how my kids' school experience was and wanting to create an experience that I would want for my kids.
Absolutely.
And I see you do that. And, Joe, one of the things I'm most impressed at, and we hear this from our staff, we hear this from parents who are in the building, about just the changes at Mayberry this year and just this dramatic sense. And the way they describe it is just things are different. What's different at Mayberry? And that's a hard question for you to answer probably because you weren't there before. But what are some big things that are going on at Mayberry that people, when they walk in the door, they may or may not notice? What would you say those were?
Yeah, we talk about this with our team all the time. In the summertime, we were fortunate enough to get a lot of support from the district and town level with respect to supporting building needs and or just aesthetic type deals where you knew the kids would be excited. I mean, you walk in our main lobby and there's a TV that scrolls kids' pictures and information for parents and all those sort of things, and it's like, oh my God, this is the coolest place ever, right? Because we put a TV up. But at the end of the day, it's the identity for us that we're going to be a building that's always going to communicate in as many forms as we can. We take a lot of pride in that, and you'll never see, not only in a phone call or an email, but you'll never see an adult walk by a kid without a smile, without a high five, without a dab, without something that signifies like, I see you and I'm proud of what you're doing. And if not, then we're going to think about a different way to handle this situation, and we're going to lead each other together through it. So, I think number one, it starts with that family aspect and communicating with our families as well as adults and with our kids. We also talk about being consistent. And so, every day you're going to walk in and you're going to get the same face at the front door. I'm going to give you a high five. It's getting a little colder, so that might be inside a little bit more as the winter months approach. But you'll see those same adults there every day for you. And, in times of celebration, in times of challenge, we look at those both as opportunities. And so I think I said this before, but we're really good and we're becoming really good at everything we can control. We can't control as adults how our ride was into work that day or how the night was before, and neither can the kids. And we understand that. And we take a lot of pride in understanding who our kids are, who our families are, who we are as people and as team members, and how we can continue to grow together. And then ultimately, I think a big thing for us is not to give the 3C here, the communication and consistency, but is our celebrations. I think that we celebrate a lot of exemplifying not only our Tiger Ways to Be, but just the great accomplishments our kids have. And it doesn't have to be a test score. It doesn't have to be you're winning a perfect attendance award, which are important, and we do on a weekly basis for different grade levels. But it's also that celebration of, last time, I handled this situation this way, and this time I was able to work through it and have a better conversation. And I couldn't be prouder of our kids, our staff members for sometimes where, I was late to school 4 days in a row, but I'm here on Friday, and the conversation is, we're proud of you that you're here on Friday. Let's make it on Monday, and let's move forward.
Yeah.
And so you talked about last year, and it's, last year you certainly look back and you learn from the past and things that you want to have as areas of success and opportunity. And as you're in the present and move forward, you control what you can and you create your own celebrations.
Yeah, and that's certainly happening, and we can see that. I think for our families at home, and I'm thinking about my own parents. We all as parents interacted with principals. We for some parents, those phone calls were about awards, and for some of those are about notifications. So we all have definitions of principals in our head, and we see that as the principal, the person who kind of greets the buses, etc. But for you, you're living the life of a principal every day right now, and I remember that experience as being very different, and some surprises as I was experiencing that. What for you? Talk to us about how your sense of that role and how you like it. What's it like?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I love it. Because for me, I'm an extension of my team. And so, one thing that I believe good leaders do is, they're able to take a look at a balcony view of what's going on the dance floor and not pretend like every move they're going to make is pretty, but also kind of get that input from your team members, get that input from your families, get that input from your kids. You can learn a lot from a kindergartner just by sitting down and talking to them at lunch. For me, it's been a lot of, asking questions and getting kind of a sense of, what our kids, our families, our teachers, look to be successful, and then being able to kind of develop a plan for our families and our family. When I say family, I mean our Mayberry School family, to be successful and to have an opportunity to come in every day and smile and know that, as a principal, I think, and this in your past, and our administrators who've been on your show will certainly attest to this, is you're always on camera. The lights are always on you. So every decision that you make and every conversation you have is an opportunity, is the way I look at it. As an opportunity for a relationship, as an opportunity to grow, both individually and within your team members. And, most importantly for me, what hasn't changed from a PE teacher back in 2004 to a principal in 2018 is the love for kids. And if you can smile, with kids around, it doesn't matter if, the situation is as challenging as it may be. But you can turn back and know a kid's going to smile and be great with that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's the neatest part of working in the education space and with kids, is that opportunity to work, but to be around children that you can inspire. And I found that as I moved into younger grades, I certainly really enjoyed my time in high school. You felt like you're a part of that kind of that bridge to adulthood. But man, and the excitement, the energy, and the almost feeling of untapped potential in elementary kids. I look back in third grade, no one sees themselves as a failure. And our systems, unfortunately, teach people that pretty quickly, that's a reality. But we have a chance to talk to kids about who they are. You're a great reader. You're a success story. You're going to college. We're proud of you, and speak those words over those kids so they become that. That's what you do. I watch you do in the hallways. I love watching you walk down the hallways, talking to the kids and seeing their reaction. I see your teachers doing that. So, with all this being said, we're talking about big ideals, but with all this, Mayberry is a place where we're working for school transformation and change, and certainly looking to make Mayberry School this school that emerges as a school in our community that people look to and come to. For that to happen, what are 2 or 3 things that are most important to you to kind of accomplish that vision, move that forward?
Yeah, sure. I think number one, it's that belief and that family and that cultural environment where we feel like we're in this thing together. So that I noted that community feel, that communication, that consistency, and that celebration. Those things are important to continue no matter where we are in the school environment and even at home, So I think you noted this before with those phone calls home, those both positive and, hey, opportunity phone calls, if you will, that get made home. But those are ways that, within our culture in the building, when you see our adults talk to kids, when you see our kids talk to each other, you feel that I'm proud of you. And it's not just lip service. I'm really proud of you for not only walking under the lights so the door doesn't hit you, but showing how you can be a leader in the hallway and be somebody that other kids can emulate. Whether it's you're a first grader being that leader down the hallway, whether you're a fifth grader reading to kindergartners in their classroom, or whether or not you're somebody that's working through a challenge that you've had throughout the day and able to bounce back and just go into your math block and get it done. And so one thing we're really, really proud of is that learning culture. And when you walk in, there's always a smile, there's always a high five, and there's always an opportunity for our kids to grow. I think the second piece here is that, we have a culture of learning. And so when you walk in a classroom, gone are the days that you and I and many of our viewers had, which is, the teacher's going to sit here and talk to me.
Right.
We're going to have different stations. We're going to have different technology. We're going to have opportunities for teachers and support staff members who really care about kids to work on ways to enrich their education and also address any needs that they may have. And that workshop method, that those stations that you'd see in a classroom where kids are working through problems together, able to lead each other and think together to ultimately learn, are really what we're really proud of. And that learning culture is something that I think is part of your school culture as well, but it certainly resonates no matter what grade level you're in. And I think lastly, we want to continue to be a school that's proud of our successes and proud of our relationships and communication with our families, proud of our ability of our kids to grow and show results, and proud of knowing who we are. We live in a data-driven society, and whether it's parents want to know how their kids are doing at that moment in class and that communication online, or whether that's whole scale, with somebody like our superintendent, our leader, presenting to the Board of Education on how our kids are doing at each school. We know who we are and we know where we want to go, and we're really confident in our plan and confident in our kids and our team members and our families that we're going to get there.
Yeah, and I mean, you've hammered this theme this entire time that we've been sitting here talking of community, culture, communication, and celebration, bringing those together. And those are certainly just incredible ingredients for success for children. And man, Joe, I'm super excited about it. So let's hit one nut and bolt thing that I know is really important to you: this is school attendance. And I know you've worked with me on our district attendance committee. I know you're super passionate about the fact that we can't grow if we're not here. Can you talk to our families who are at home who maybe aren't as aware of the seriousness of school attendance, being in school every day, whether it's from kindergarten to pre-K? Let's start with pre-K to 12th grade. What are some things you would say to those families if you had a brief moment to do so?
Yeah, I obviously, as you said, when our kids aren't there, we miss them. And we miss them not only for them not being there to see their faces and their runny noses at this time of the year, and but ultimately we miss them as we feel like we're not able to give them the best opportunity to learn. So this time of year, especially as the cold approaches, and we have the sniffles or we have reasons that are very easy to stay home, both from the adult and the kid perspective. Being there is number one. Chronic absenteeism, for every kid that's chronically absent, it's well documented that they miss 6 months to a year of school for every kid that's chronically absent. And particularly for us and our K through 3 levels, it's no secret that the smaller the child, the more susceptible they are to getting sick and to missing school. So, at that foundation level of, allowing our kids to understand not allowing, but having our kids understand that being in school is so important, and our families knowing that. We've met with a number of families. We visit homes. Most importantly, we have our school-based health center, our family resource center, staff members in the building that are able to support any sort of need that our families may have to make sure their kids get to school. It's just so important for us because, like you said, when you're not here, you're not learning. And that has such a big impact on how we're able to celebrate and able to grow and ultimately provide the best opportunity for our kids. That my message to parents would be if your child's not able to come to school, to communicate with us.
Yeah.
Whether it's a call, an email, a dojo message to the teacher, however communications that we have that work, to please let us know. And if it's going to be something that's going to be more than a one-time deal, then let us know and how we can better support or best support.
Yeah.
Our school day runs from 8:15 our doors open, and kids get picked up at 3:20. So, one thing I'm really proud of is the fact that our parents know that it's important for our kids to be in school. And so when they're there, they leave at 3:20. I mean, not 3:10 or 2:50. We know we stay till the end of the day because every minute counts.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for our families to continue to help us make every minute count for their kids.
Yeah. No, and I think it's so important. And frankly, we need help from our families. When we think about when we think about secondary attendance, we talk about our students. We talk about helping our kids prioritize coming to school, making that decision, seeing the value of being there. But when we talk about our elementary kids, the sobering message here is we're really talking to about attendance. We're talking to our families. And we're talking to moms and dads who have to prioritize the school day. We have 180 school days in a year, an incredibly advanced curriculum to work through. If we can't get your child on grade level reading by grade 3, your child is going to experience challenge continuing to move through the system. If your child, and where our greatest district attendance issues are, frankly, in kindergarten, we're seeing almost 6 to 7% elevated levels of absenteeism at the kindergarten ratio, 15 to 16% of our kindergartners being chronically absent from school, and even higher in the pre-K setting. And part of that is the sense that kindergarten is just a place to come play. You miss a day, it's not that big a deal, you're just learning letters. The reality, again, is if our kindergartners by end of kindergarten aren't moving towards literacy, being literate, being able to being beginning readers, that year is really hard to catch. So I want to echo your comments. We need our families to get our kids to school.
Absolutely.
And certainly we all understand things happen. Kids get sick. If your child's significantly sick, the child needs to stay home. Where we support you, call the nurse, let us know. We can work down that. But, a runny nose, go to school. A headache, get to school. A vacation day, go to school. A 90-minute delay, go to school.
Absolutely.
So these are big, big, important things our families could really do to help. And, Joe, I really appreciate what you're doing at Mayberry, man. The future is just so bright there with your leadership, and it's so refreshing just to go there, to see you interacting with staff. So we're hitting the end of our segment. Here comes the really important part here.
Yeah, okay.
So let's. I know you're a big sports fan. I mean, you were our athletic director, for goodness sake. So why don't you give us a sense of some favorite sport teams? Let's go. Favorite sport teams, favorite athlete of all time.
Favorite sport team, favorite athlete of all time. Oof. So I'd say my favorite sports team, though I'm not super proud of it, though in New England I have a little bit of bragging rights.
I know where this is going.
Yeah, it is the New York Giants.
Oh, Joe.
Currently trending
so well.
currently trending towards the number 1 pick, which isn't really a great thing when you talk about a sports team. But as an athletic director and as a former athlete, still like to think of myself as a current athlete.
Oh,
right?
You still got it.
But what's special for me is being able to share that with my kids, who unfortunately I'm dragging them through this whole, Giants. The Yankees have been a little bit better lately.
Yes, you've had that.
UConn basketball has been better in time, and those sort of things. When you talk about a favorite athlete of all time, I can't really say that I have one. I can't really stick myself to one person that I've been identified with.
Thanks for tuning in. That's it from the classroom. East Hartford Public Schools is committed to schools that are the pride of our community, and we are really excited about what's going on at Mayberry School. So until the next time, we'll see you then. Thank you.